If true, the news would represent the biggest escalation of the Ukraine war so far. Across Sunday and Monday, word began to leak out in major newspapers that soldiers from a Russian ally were joining the conflict on Moscow's side, that thousands of foreign troops were already being trained inside Russia itself for combat in Ukraine. Given that the Kremlin has threatened nuclear escalation against any nation that puts boots on the ground in Ukraine's favor, this in and of itself was newsworthy. But it was the identity of the Russian ally providing the troops that turned it into a bombshell. Rather than a nearby friend like Belarus, the reports suggested that Moscow was instead relying on soldiers from North Korea. As Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Monday the 13th of October, this could mean, quote, the actual involvement of North Korea in the war. As we were writing this on Thursday, there's currently still some skepticism as to how true these rumors are. No one to date has provided visual confirmation of DPRK troops working with the Russian military in any capacity. Nonetheless, there were warning signs that something like this could be in the works. Back on October the 8th, Yonhap News Agency reported South Korea's defense chief Kim Yong-hyung telling Parliament that, quote, North Korea is likely to deploy members of its regular armed forces to Ukraine in support of Russia. In the same meeting, the minister also claimed that previous stories of North Korean officers killed in a Ukrainian missile strike on occupied territory were likely to be true. Still, the scale of the subsequent reports went way beyond anything analysts might have predicted. In its piece, The Washington Post claimed that several thousand North Koreans were already training in Russia for combat. Meanwhile, an anonymous Western diplomat briefed the Kiev Independent that the number could be as high as 10,000. The news also seemed to cause some unease in the Pentagon. Department of Defense spokesman Lieutenant Colonel Charlie Dietz told American media that, quote, we are concerned by reports of DPRK soldiers fighting on behalf of Russia, which if true would mark a significant increase in the DPRK-Russia defense relationship. This defense relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang has been building across the Ukraine war is no secret. Back in September of 2023, Vladimir Putin asked Kim Jong-un for military assistance, and the dictator was more than happy to oblige. A recent report by The Times of London estimated that Pyongyang has so far shipped 3,122mm shells to Russia, with the result that, quoting here, half of the shells fired by Russian artillery are of North Korean origin. Incredibly, this number may be an underestimate. South Korean intelligence puts the total number of shells delivered to Russia at 5 million, plus missiles. On top of that, Kim has also lent political support to Putin's invasion, calling it a, quote, holy war against the West. In return, Putin has signed a mutual defense pact with North Korea. Ratified by the Russian Duma last Tuesday, it states the two nations must give the other military assistance in the event of an attack. Barely was the ink dry before Moscow was threatening South Korea with war if Seoul responded to its neighbors' provocations. Even so, the idea that Pyongyang would actually dispatch troops to fight in Ukraine is a whole other level of escalation. In fact, it's such a stretch of the imagination that some officials think it's bullcrap of the highest order. According to the New York Times, quoting here, American intelligence and military officials expressed some skepticism at the Ukrainian claims that North Korean mercenaries were now fighting in significant numbers against Ukrainian forces. This is something that we're going to return to later in this section. The arguments that this is all wildly overblown and that the only North Koreans really assisting Russia are the engineers and specialists needed to operate their donated missiles. But for now, let's try and take these claims at face value, because if DPRK soldiers really are fighting in the war, then it raises an extremely important question. What are they doing there? Now, the most obvious answer is that they're plugging gaps in a Russian army that's been mauled by 2.5 years of intense fighting. British and American intelligence has claimed that Moscow lost an average of over 1,200 soldiers killed and wounded per day in September, making it Russia's bloodiest month of the entire war. Overall, the United States estimates that Russia has lost 115,000 killed and 500,000 wounded since February of 2022. That is an insane number, even for a nation the size of Russia. And while Moscow is still recruiting around 25,000 new soldiers a month, spiking pay for volunteers and ballooning signing bonuses suggests that recruitment's getting quite a bit harder. North Korean troops could therefore be a way of replacing all these casualties without resorting to mass mobilization. Talking to the Times, American officials declared that, quote, Russia is trying to avoid a mass mobilization, which would be deeply unpopular domestically. The Institute for the Study of War echoed this in its October the 15th update, claiming that the reported commitment of North Korean personnel into combat operations in Russia highlights Putin's continued reliance on pursuing alternative force generation avenues instead of committing to declaring partial or general mobilization. Yet, while this theory makes sense on the surface, if you look a little deeper, it starts to seem unlikely. After all, 10,000 North Korean troops would only last roughly 8 days of fighting at current attrition rates, hardly enough for it to be worthwhile. Nor would it be as simple as jamming a rifle in their hands, waving at Ukrainian lines and shouting, "Go!" Even the meat wave assaults Russia is using in Donbass require coordination, a major issue when almost no North Koreans speak Russian. As one military analyst told the BBC, it wasn't even that easy to include hundreds of Russian prisoners in the army at first, and all those guys spoke Russian. A more realistic take here might be that advanced by the Ukrainian military analyst outlet Militani, which suggested that the North Koreans could take over functions like border patrol, thereby freeing up more Russian troops to send to the front lines. That would also be a good way to work around the likely low quality of any North Korean soldiers. As the UK's former defence attaché in Moscow, John Foreman, told the Kiev Independent about the DPRK troops, quoting him here, "Their military effectiveness is questionable, and they will be cannon fodder for Ukrainian defenders." But just because such a deployment might be questionable doesn't mean it isn't happening. Pyongyang has deployed small numbers of troops to dozens of previous conflicts, from the Vietnam War to the Yom Kippur War and Syria's civil conflict. Up to 4,000 DPRK troops fought in Angola, and their engineers are said to have built tunnels for Hezbollah. More to the point, allowing his troops to get actual combat experience would be invaluable for Kim Jong-un. Right now, Ukraine is the war zone with the highest level of innovation on the planet. Drone warfare there is evolving so fast that today it's almost unrecognizable from just early 2022. If Kim wants his troops to truly understand modern warfare, there is no better place for a baptism of fire. And the dictator might have every reason to get his soldiers some battlefield experience. Back in January this year, foreign policy experts Robert L. Karlin and Sigrid S. Herker made waves with an essay on the specialist blog 38 North, where they argued that Kim has already taken the decision to attack South Korea. Although controversial among many analysts, the essay preceded a year of rising tensions between Pyongyang and Seoul. Should Kim really be planning a Korean War sequel, then it makes perfect sense to test his troops in the field. Any tech transfers a grateful Moscow makes in return, be they satellite or even nuclear, would be a bonus. Still, for all the rationale may make sense, the truth is that we haven't yet seen any hard evidence of North Korean troops fighting for Russia, and perhaps with good reason. Speaking to an anonymous military source in Russia, the BBC was told that, quote, "A number of North Koreans have arrived, but," quoting again, "absolutely nowhere near 3,000. Meanwhile, South Korean political scientist Park Wong-gong has suggested that there's been no evidence of the major preparations that would be required by both sides for a DPRK troop influx. As such, he expects that the only North Koreans being sent are small numbers of engineers and weapons advisors. On the slightly more paranoid side of things, though, there are those who think it's all just an information operation. Writing on X, Ukrainian journalist Ilya Ponomarenko suggested that Russia could be drip-feeding rumors about Pyongyang joining the war in an attempt to scare the West into a peace deal. In his words, "So far, this, along with the Kremlin's enhanced military cooperation treaty with Kim, looks much more like yet another attempt to raise the stakes in the eyes of Western decision-makers. So leaders must immediately switch to begging Putin for peace and offer him compromises on Ukraine before it's too late." Yet for all the arrival of DPRK soldiers would mark a major turning point in the war, it's arguable that the bigger change has already happened. When the Russian State Duma ratified the new treaty with North Korea, it sent out a message to the wider world that should also be seen as a wake-up call. All too often, we see people rejecting the idea that there is some new axis emerging in global affairs, that Moscow, Pyongyang, Tehran, and Beijing are forming a terrifyingly close alliance. Even as Iranian drones hit Ukrainian cities, even as Russia threatens South Korea and considers arming the Houthis, even as China offers moral support to Iran, there are still those who believe these are all separate problems, discrete issues that foreign policy dilettantes can pick and choose between. Well, the growing closeness between Moscow and Pyongyang shows that this might not be the case for much longer. North Korean troops may or may not arrive in Ukraine in the coming weeks, but the expanding military alliance between Putin and Kim should still worry us all. In our next story today, we travel to the South Asian nation of Pakistan, and specifically to the nation's southwestern province of Baluchistan. A restive region at the best of times, a rising tide of terror attacks in Balochistan has come to a head in the past few weeks at the exact time that the Pakistani government welcomed dignitaries from across Eurasia for a major summit. We'll focus on the events of Friday, October the 11th in the Balochistan province's northeastern Duki district. There, an organization called Junaid Coal Company operates a handful of small private coal mines, staffed by a mix of Pakistani Pashto speakers and international employees. In the late hours of the night, on Friday the 11th, the Junaid Coal Company's mines came under attack by a group of some 40 or so attackers armed with guns, hand grenades, and even rockets, plus at least one drone. The assault was a protracted affair, with local authorities reporting that the gunmen attacked the mines for a full 30 to 60 minutes, and their intent in doing so was deadly. 21 miners would be killed in the attack, along with 6 others being wounded. Some were killed in their beds while they slept, while others were woken up, brought outside, lined up and executed. 4 Afghan nationals were among the dead and another 4 among the wounded. No group would claim responsibility for the attack, which drew widespread protest from both Pakistan and Afghanistan and prompted mass demonstrations by locals to demand the arrest of the attackers. Said one protester to France 24, quote, "We are protesting here for our protection as terrorists always attack mine workers and coal-loaded vehicles and law enforcement agencies fail to provide protection. Our lives don't matter to the government." The quote ends. The owner of the local mines, a businessman named Kairullah Nassar, stated publicly that the mines had been threatened by the militants, quote, "for some time, but that there was no advance warning given of the attack, either by militants or by local authorities." Survivors of the attack recounted statements from their attackers that implied that the militants had indeed made prior threats to, quote, "When the attackers got closer, they shouted, 'We told you to stop work here. Why didn't you?' Then they opened fire." All 10 of the mines that fell under attack were destroyed, including the machinery that had been inside. At the time of writing, however, no arrests have been reported to global media. Nor was this attack the only notable terror attack in Balochistan, even just this month. On October the 7th, in the city of Karachi in neighboring Sindh province and not far from Balochistan, 2 Chinese nationals were killed in an explosion not far from the Karachi International Airport. Those Chinese nationals were traveling in a convoy late at night, carrying a larger number of Chinese nationals who work in Pakistan. 8 others were wounded in the strike, while the 2 Chinese citizens killed were later identified as employees of the Port Qasim Electric Power Company, a joint Sino-Pakistani venture with which the Pakistani government has been negotiating to provide more favorable economic terms for them. In an emailed statement sent to the global press, a prominent Baloch separatist organization took credit for the attack, the Baloch Liberation Army, or BLA. According to the BLA, the bombing was a suicide attack using an explosive device concealed within a vehicle, while the members of the, quote, high-level convoy were a mix of Chinese engineers and investors. And in a third terror attack in another part of the country, gunmen disguised as Muslim women veiled in burqas launched an assault on a regional police headquarters on October the 14th. In the attack, 5 gunmen wearing suicide vests engaged in a brutal firefight with police in Pakistan's northwest province, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. 4 policemen manning the gate at the time of the attack were killed, and the ensuing firefight would last nearly 6 hours before the 5 terrorists were ultimately killed. The attack came just hours after the funeral of local head constable Shaista Khan, who had been killed in an attack earlier that same day. The group that claimed credit for this attack was Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, otherwise known as the Pakistani Taliban, an organization independent from the Taliban that governs Afghanistan. Now, we bring you the news of this wave of terror attacks in Pakistan for 2 fundamental reasons: to ask why and to ask why now. And in this particular case, the simpler question to answer there is the second one, why now? That's because of a major regional summit for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a 2-day gathering of important world leaders held in Pakistan's capital city of Islamabad. On the order of regional summits, the SCO is one of the more important ones to take place each year, bringing together China, Russia, India, Pakistan, and Iran, plus several other Central Asian and Eastern European nations. Collectively, the bloc claims to represent 4 of every 10 people on Earth and a bit under a third of the global GDP. For Pakistan to be hosting the summit is a really big deal, but after the wave of attacks, this year's SCO came amidst a near-complete lockdown in Islamabad. With Pakistani troops roaming the street, the government arrested hundreds of supporters of Pakistan's former Prime Minister Imran Khan as they demonstrated in the streets and got very little of the benefit they'd hoped for from what was supposed to be a genteel and important affair. From an optics perspective, the threat of violence in Pakistan turned this year's SCO into everything Islamabad was trying to avoid, a conference that painted the picture of a nation where foreigners and even Pakistanis are not safe, and where even the wealthiest and most important cities had to be kept under stringent armed guard. Notably, the Pakistani Taliban attack on the regional police headquarters came on the same day China's Premier Li Qiang touched down in Pakistan in advance of the SCO, plus a few other meetings scheduled into his visit. This was the first time a Chinese government leader had visited Pakistan in 11 full years, plus a rare visit from a senior leader from India, and the environment was not exactly what Pakistan had hoped for. So that's the why now element in all of this. Organizations that wanted to do harm to the Pakistani government took advantage of security vulnerabilities to launch high-profile attacks at a time when Pakistan would have to weather major diplomatic embarrassment as a result. But the more important question is why these attacks happened at all, and what about Pakistan exactly are these groups claiming to fight against? Now, as we'll explain, the motivations behind each attack do not appear to be uniform in nature, so not every problem we're about to mention is felt the same way or at all by every group that we're referencing. But the best place to start by far is with the long-running insurgency that's had a grip on Balochistan province for decades. This insurgency, run by not just one, but multiple ethnic separatist groups of Pakistan's Baloch minority, is driven by a few fundamental grievances. Balochistan province is a resource-rich place, a place where industry is thriving, yet its people, particularly those of the Baloch ethnicity, broadly remain quite poor and disconnected from the economic boom in their homeland. Instead, that boom is taken advantage of by a mix of Pakistani private businesses, the national government, and foreign interests, particularly Chinese. In Balochistan, Chinese enterprise benefits from lucrative state contracts, minimal oversight, and foreign labor recruited from a population of Afghan migrants, rather than the people living on the land that China helps to exploit. In protest of their situation at the fringes of Balochistan province's resource extraction economy, Baloch separatist groups, predominantly the Baloch Liberation Army, or BLA that we mentioned before, have carried out numerous attacks against interests of the Pakistani government, the national military, and Chinese business. We've spoken about a prior eruption of violence here on the Situation Room back in August of this year, when the BLA led a wave of violence against police stations, highways, rail lines, and more, leaving over 70 people dead in its wake. In a September attack, armed men killed 7 laborers who had come to Balochistan from other parts of Pakistan. Back in 2021, an attack on workers affiliated to a dam project would kill 9 Chinese nationals and 4 other victims, while another attack that same year killed 4 people in a luxury hotel where the Chinese ambassador to Pakistan was staying. In 2022, a BLA suicide bombing would kill 3 Chinese tutors and their Pakistani driver near the Confucius Institute in Karachi. Numerous other Chinese workers have been killed and their industrial projects attacked by the various Baloch insurgent groups. Thousands of Chinese citizens work and live in Pakistan on a wide range of industrial and development projects, including many related to China's flagship Belt and Road Initiative. Pakistani and foreign non-Chinese laborers who take jobs that the Baloch separatists believe should go to and enrich locals, or who come to Balochistan in what the separatists perceive as a desire to exploit its mineral wealth, have also been frequent targets in the violence. During the attack on the Junaid Coal Company mines, it's important to note that the Pakistanis who were killed were Pashto speakers from Balochistan, making them members of a local minority. That identity would quite likely make them appear as unwanted outsiders in the eyes of the Baloch militants who are thought to be responsible. And as Chinese and other international interest in Pakistan's resources has ramped up, particularly via the increasing presence of Saudi Arabia, the ethnic insurgencies of Balochistan have appeared to ratchet up the intensity of their own attacks. The goal is to deter further foreign involvement and make conditions for current economic projects in Balochistan untenable. But again, we must reiterate that Baloch insurgencies, and particularly the BLA, are not the only problem for the Pakistani government. Notably, although the BLA claimed credit for the attack on the convoy of Chinese nationals in Karachi, they denied any involvement in the attack on the mines. To be clear, although no group has yet taken credit, there are a number of other groups within Balochistan who could have had the motive and the means to carry out the attack. Balochistan's separatist groups gather under a wide umbrella of organizations, and they share their territory with Islamist militants who operate with different motivations and at times at cross purposes to the Baloch separatist movement. For instance, the Pakistani Taliban claimed credit for the suicide attack on the police station on Monday the 14th in an area where Baloch insurgents rarely operate. It was the Pakistani Taliban that called for protests in Islamabad during the SCO summit, not any Baloch insurgency group, although it's impossible to ignore the ways that the Pakistani Taliban, pursuing its own goals, can assist the aims of the Baloch separatists and vice versa. In March of this year, the Pakistani Taliban launched a suicide attack in northern Pakistan that killed 5 Chinese engineers working on a hydropower project. Did they coordinate their objectives with the BLA? Probably not, but it's difficult to argue that the BLA's interests weren't advanced by the Pakistani Taliban's act of terrorism. In the immediate aftermath of the SCO summit, there's a decent chance that the pace of violence in Pakistan may begin to calm down, at least for a little while. But what this most recent wave of terror attacks has demonstrated is that even though Pakistan's various insurgent groups are driven by different philosophies and practical motivations, they tend to center on the same targets. If we take the BLA at their word that somebody else was responsible for the attack on the coal mines, then no fewer than 3 insurgent groups in Pakistan saw the SCO coming and chose to launch mass casualty attacks in response. Over the last few years, they've all shown a willingness to attack Chinese business interests and foreign labor, and they've done so in the asymmetric and autonomous way that poses the greatest possible problem for Pakistani security forces. Pakistan is dealing with dozens of insurgencies operating independently from each other, but fighting broadly similar battles using broadly similar tactics to attack in unpredictable ways. That asymmetry may prove more difficult for Pakistan to deal with than any single one of these organizations on their own. Next, we turn our attention to the Chagos Islands. If the treaty is hammered out in time, then next March will witness a truly historic moment. For the first time in 200 years, the sun will set on the remnants of the British Empire. For roughly 1 hour, overseas possessions as far-flung as the Pitcairn Islands in the Pacific and the sovereign bases of Akrotiri and Dekilia in the eastern Mediterranean will all be in darkness. The era of the empire where the sun never set will finally be over. The immediate cause of this historic sunset in late March will be the passing of British Antarctic territory into the perma-darkness of southern winter. But really, it will be the events of October the 3rd, 2024 that allowed it to happen in the first place. That's because October the 3rd is the day that London announced it was surrendering sovereignty over British Indian Ocean territory. Assuming Parliament ratifies the decision, control will soon be handed to the nation of Mauritius. With that, Britain will no longer be able to claim the sun is always shining upon at least one of its territories. Yet for the whole sun setting over the empire thing makes a good hook, the real reason we're talking about this deal has little to do with nighttime and a whole lot more to do with defense policy. See, British Indian Ocean territory is comprised of the Chagos Islands, the largest of which is Diego Garcia. And Diego Garcia just happens to be home to a US military base that ranks among the most important in the world. Leased to Uncle Sam by the UK back in the 1960s in return for a $14 million discount on nuclear weapons, Diego Garcia sits within easy range of multiple regions Washington needs to keep an eye on. It was from this base that US aircraft were dispatched during the Gulf War and the later conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's from here that surveillance is today carried out across the Middle East, and it was also to this base that the CIA dragged suspects during the War on Terror. Here's how War on the Rocks explains the importance of Diego Garcia. The island's lagoon houses one of America's pre-positioned military equipment stockpiles. The runway is capable of hosting US heavy bombers, the port supports visiting American and Allied ships and submarines, and the island's various pieces of intelligence infrastructure provides unparalleled coverage in this vast region. This importance is something the new deal between the UK and Mauritius recognises. In return for Port Louis gaining the Chagos Islands, London will be allowed to lease Diego Garcia for another 99 years. While this will mean Britain paying Mauritius an undisclosed annual sum, it should mean the US base can continue operating into the next century. Yet for all those involved with the negotiations, from British Foreign Secretary David Lammy to President Joe Biden, have claimed this deal is a great success, others are less sure. In fact, multiple military experts have since emerged to insist that it's the equivalent of Britain not just shooting itself in the foot, but blowing its whole damn leg off. We'll be covering these experts' view later in this segment, but first we need to take a quick detour into history to explain what exactly the Chagos Islands are. A scattered archipelago lost in the vast emptiness of the Indian Ocean, the Chagos Islands spent millennia uninhabited before they were colonized by France. The French established plantations and shipped in slaves who became the ancestors of the modern people living there before losing the islands to Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. For some who are against the new treaty, like expert in land warfare Dr. Jack Watlin, this history is key, as it shows Mauritius never controlled the archipelago at any point. Instead, as Watling writes for the Royal United Services Institute think tank, quoting, "The French and British administered Mauritius and the Chagos archipelago are one territory under their respective colonial administrations. This grouping was done for administrative rather than practical reasons. After all, the Chagos Islands lie over 2,400 kilometers from Mauritius. But when decolonization got underway in the mid-20th century, it meant that the islands could not legally be split off from Mauritius. The UN had specifically ruled against dividing up colonies prior to them gaining independence. Yet London would go ahead and split the colony anyway. To be clear, this split was done with the agreement of the Mauritian authorities, who were paid £3 million in 1965 and given continued fishing access to the waters around the islands. They were also given a British security guarantee in return. Exactly how fair this deal was is pretty uncertain. At the time, everyone seemed happy, but Mauritius today claims that London blackmailed them into it by threatening to withhold independence. Whatever the truth, there's no doubt over what happened next. London handed control of Diego Garcia over to Washington and set about deporting the 1,500 or so Chagossians living on the archipelago. Here's how The Economist describes it. British authorities blocked families returning from trips, cut off the supply of teachers and doctors, gassed the islanders' dogs, and eventually deported anyone still left. The quote ends. Many were exiled to Mauritius, where they faced such extreme poverty and discrimination that they were eventually resettled in England and given British citizenship. Others remained in Mauritius, while others were resettled in the Seychelles. And that's pretty much how things went for the rest of the 20th century. America had its vital base, Britain had its colony, and it seemed that things would stay that way forever. While a new generation that took power in Mauritius began to claim that the Chagos Islands were rightfully theirs, it seemed unlikely that anyone would ever listen. But then, the new century dawned, and things began to unexpectedly change. The first major shift came in 2000, when the British High Court ruled that the expulsion of the Chagossians had been illegal and ordered that they be allowed to return. Although the British government blocked the ruling, it was the first crack in the dam. Over the next couple of decades, rulings against Britain began to stack up. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea and the UN General Assembly all wound up agreeing that the islands belonged to Mauritius. But the killer blow came in 2019, when the International Court of Justice issued a non-binding ruling that the UK had violated international law by splitting the Chagos Islands off from Mauritius before decolonization. 3 years later, African leaders made a push at the UN to begin speaking as one on the issue. Foreign Policy describes how this was at least in part driven by, quote, what they perceived as hypocrisy from the UK and the United States, which were ignoring multiple international court rulings on Chagos while calling for African nations to support their stance against Russia's colonization and war in Ukraine. All too aware that ignoring these rulings might undermine the international order, London and Washington changed tack that same year. During the blink-and-you-miss-it premiership of Liz Truss, Britain opened negotiations with Mauritius. It was these talks that paved the way for the deal announced this October. It's a deal that, it's fair to say, has divided opinion. On the one hand, you have people like the lead UK negotiator Jonathan Powell, whose position the think tank Chatham House reports as, quote, this deal was reached in close consultation with US officials and put the base on legally safe ground for the first time in decades. Others, meanwhile, take the position that the ruling was righting a moral wrong. War on the Rocks writes that, by running the Diego Garcia base with Mauritius's consent, the United States will underscore its commitment to international law and the rules-based order. On the other hand, though, you have those who think the deal, rather than being some sort of masterstroke, was an act of irreparable self-harm. Chief among those is Dr. Jack Watlin, who wrote for RUSI that, quote, the deal demonstrates worrying strategic ineptitude in a world that the UK government describes as being characterized by great power competition. Dr. Watling's arguments are many and varied, but the chief one is that by voluntarily surrendering control over the Chagos Islands, Britain played right into the hands of its enemies, specifically into the hands of Russia and China. In the case of Russia, Moscow was one of the major countries pushing for the islands to be handed over to Mauritius. Dr. Watlin believes this wasn't done out of any great affinity for the Mauritians, but as a cheap way of imposing costs on the UK. By backing down so easily, London may have encouraged the Kremlin to try other ways of harming British interests. Even if Moscow steps back, though, other nations may now start aggressively pursuing UK overseas territories through the international courts. The most likely candidate would be Argentina, which lays claims to the Falkland Islands, but there are also fears that Spain may try and regain Gibraltar. And then there are the military bases in the Eastern Mediterranean. As Chatham House writes, there are legitimate questions to be raised over setting a precedent that could undermine RAF Akrotiri and Dekilia in Cyprus, which remain sovereign UK bases after Cyprus's independence in 1960. Still, these considerations are unlikely to worry anyone outside of Britain. A far bigger concern to the world is the role China may come to play in the Chagos Islands' future. In 2019, Beijing and Port Louis signed a major free trade agreement. Should Mauritius decide to develop the Chagos Islands economically, Dr. Watling fears that China would be the obvious candidate to build infrastructure. To quote his IUSI piece again, the most likely investor in such projects is China, and based on what China has done elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific, its state-owned enterprises will allow it to have pre-staged equipment at these sites that, if an escalation were to occur over Taiwan, for example, could contribute to disrupting operations from Diego Garcia. Elsewhere, the article highlights the risk Mauritius will grant fishing rights around Diego Garcia to Beijing, thereby allowing Chinese spy vessels to bring high-tech sensors close to the base. Less dramatically, others have warned that any nation that's close to China simply can't be trusted around military secrets, with The Economist writing, Britain's experience with Hong Kong, where China has flagrantly disregarded its post-handover treaty commitments, should give some pause. To be clear, this view is not universal, and some analysts believe the Chinese threat is overplayed. Foreign Policy points out that Mauritius is one of only 2 African countries not taking part in China's Belt and Road Initiative, while Chatham House notes that the Chinese Navy only has a limited presence in the Indian Ocean. Instead, both outlets agree that the deal is more likely to benefit another rising power, India. Geopolitically, the Chagos Islands lie closer to India than they do to Mauritius, and Port Louis is one of the African capitals that's friendliest to New Delhi. As such, defense researcher Samuel Bashfield has argued that, quoting him here, the likeliest power to benefit from the sovereignty agreement is India, a US ally. Given that the US hopes India will become an Asian counterweight to China, this may be no bad thing. Although there still remains the possibility of other problems with the deal. One is that Mauritius has signed the African Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone Treaty, prohibiting the stockpiling or manufacturing of nuclear devices on its territory. This is problematic because the UK and US position is that nukes can be stored on Diego Garcia. While it's unclear if any are actually kept there, Washington wants to keep its options open. Whether Mauritius will be able to allow that while complying with the treaty is an open question. Another point of contention is whether or not the deal actually helps the US and the UK win any friends in the global south. The optimistic view says that countries in Africa will be more willing to listen to London on things like Russia's invasion of Ukraine now that the UK has shown that it respects international law. The pessimistic view says that they'll just find other reasons to accuse Britain of hypocrisy instead. And finally, there's the fate of the Chagossians themselves. Scattered between Mauritius, Britain, and the Seychelles, the islanders and their descendants do not speak with one voice on the treaty. However, several who live in the UK told the BBC that they were angry that they were not party to the negotiations, with London and Port Louis instead stitching up a deal behind their backs. To be fair, it's a deal that requires Mauritius to commit to resettling the Chagossians anywhere they wish apart from Diego Garcia, although there are already signs that Mauritanian authorities might be up to something tricky. Here's how The Economist describes it. Mauritius itself has suggested that only Chagossians with Mauritanian passports will be able to resettle, locking out those now in Britain or the Seychelles. If that's the case, then this new deal will not erase the colonial crime Britain claims to be so ashamed of. Rather, it will simply mean an African country is now ignoring the wishes of the Chagossians rather than a European one. Taken together then, it's clear that there's more to the UK's handover of the Chagos Islands than simple fun facts about the sun finally setting on the British Empire. This is a complex, nuanced deal in which responsibilities to the island's inhabitants must be weighed up by the real politic of maintaining one of America's most important overseas bases. Whether the UK has made the right choice is something that we'll just have to wait to find out. And in our final story of the week, we turn our attention to Chechnya, where the murderous dictator of this particular Russian republic has made headlines yet again. This time, rather than announcing purges of any particularly marginalized group in Chechnya or gifting Vladimir Putin the dead body of any political opponent, Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov is threatening a blood feud, not just against anybody, but against several prominent lawmakers within his own nation. The news broke on October the 10th, relying on sourcing from Russian state news organization TASS. On that day, Russian media reported that Kadyrov had levied accusations against a trio of parliamentarians from neighboring regions of Russia, claiming that the three had attempted to commission Kadyrov's assassination. According to TASS, Kadyrov made the following statement at a meeting with his own security officials to quote, "If they do not prove otherwise, I will officially declare a blood feud." The origin of the animosity between Kadyrov and these three parliamentarians includes a prominent businessman and senator from the Republic of Dagestan named Suleiman Karimov. And it's surprisingly pedestrian, at least on the outside. The issue at hand is a contentious corporate merger within Moscow involving Russia's largest online retailer, a company called Wildberries. Wildberries is trying to merge with the Rus Group, a company that specializes in outdoor advertising, billboards, stuff like that. It's pretty boring, at least on the surface. In reality, however, the merger between Rus Group and Wildberries has already turned deadly. A shootout outside Wildberries' Moscow office in September left 2 people dead. Inside Russia, the merger has become the focus of substantial political intrigue for a number of reasons. It doesn't really make much sense as a merger, since Rus Group is much smaller than Wildberries. It was being orchestrated by some shadowy figure behind the scenes that Russian business media couldn't quite identify, and it seems to have the personal support of Vladimir Putin. So the merger has already raised some eyebrows in Russia, but do stay with us here, because this is where it gets really weird. Take off your wartime geopolitics hat for a moment, because for just a little bit, we've actually got to talk business. 99% of the stake in Wildberries' company is held by one Tatyana Kim, formerly Tatyana Bakulchuk, a lifelong Muscovite who is today Russia's richest woman. She's got a net worth of about $7.4 billion, and she's the founder and CEO of Wildberries, and she's pretty much entirely self-made, besides some seed money from her then-husband. But in late July of this year, with the Wildberries merger to Rus Group actively underway, Tatyana Kim's husband made a direct appeal to Ramzan Kadyrov. He was opposed to the merger and alleged that Tatyana had, quote, left home and got mixed up with unknown people who were trying to steal their family business out from under them. Tatyana quickly filed for divorce, denying all allegations that anyone was trying to steal the company, and explained that her husband's behavior was the result of their divorce proceedings, which had previously been kept private. But now Ramzan Kadyrov was involved, and as anybody who's familiar with the Chechen dictator already knows, if Ramzan Kadyrov is involved, then it very quickly becomes the Ramzan Kadyrov show. Before long, Kadyrov was threatening to punish that Dagestani senator that we mentioned before, Suleiman Karimov, who's been known to have links to Rus Group, the organization that the Wildberries company was trying to merge with. In the shootout incident that we mentioned earlier, Kim's husband and a number of gunmen, including Chechens, would try to storm the Wildberries office and block the merger by force. All the while, Tatyana Kim and her soon-to-be ex-husband were wrestling for control, but doing it in a very public way that appeared as if it was meant to plead each of their cases to Putin himself. In Vladimir Putin's Russia, by the way, it's the man himself who holds the power to informally give out a verdict in such matters, ignoring the legal system that's technically responsible for handling things like this. Getting Putin's sign-off for big business maneuvers, in particular, is something of an unofficial expectation in the world of Russian business. In the end, Tatyana Kim won the dispute, meaning that her husband and Ramzan Kadyrov backing him would have to lose. Kim and her business partners would make commitments to Putin to create an international payment system based on the ruble and to make Wildberries into a direct competitor with global companies like Amazon and Alibaba. Putin apparently quite liked the idea, as well as Kim's commitment to directly boosting Russia's GDP and espousing what Putin and his propagandists refer to as Russian traditional values. On October 1st, the Wildberries Rus Group merger was approved, and that was that. Except for one key sticking point. The trouble with any conclusion, of course, is that Ramzan Kadyrov doesn't like to lose, and it's here that we can put back on our wartime geopolitics hats. Now, according to Kadyrov, this Dagestani senator and his 2 fellow parliamentarians tried to put a bounty on the Chechen leader's head, attempting to commission unspecified individuals to assassinate him. The senator, Karimov, and his 2 alleged accomplices, one from Dagestan and one from nearby Ingushetia, have now been charged with proving their innocence on penalty of a blood feud if they fail. Blood feuds are a pretty serious thing in Chechnya, by the way. They're a traditional custom reserved for men in which once a blood feud is declared, the person who's declared it must exact revenge on a rival by either killing that rival himself or one of his male relatives. That, of course, is never a fun time, but adding in the fact that the targets of this blood feud would be high-profile Russian politicians adds more than a little bit of extra spice to the equation. And not to mention there's a very real history here. Kadyrov has made territorial claims in the past against both the territory of Dagestan and the territory of Ingushetia. He tends to treat both as a bit of a punching bag when it suits him. Chechnya and Dagestan have shed blood against each other many times across history, and the spillover of violence from Chechnya into Dagestan has caused major problems in the past. Both regions are known for churning out Salafi jihadist terrorists, while Ingushetia has feared the spectre of violence from Chechnya for quite a while. Frankly, limited information access on all sides has meant that the general perception of the three regions' current situation, thought to be relatively peaceful and free from regional violence, is not something that can easily be verified. What we do know is that there are many in Chechnya, Dagestan, and Ingushetia who still harbour very real animosity towards each other. At the time of writing, there's no outward indicator that a blood feud has already been declared. But in this part of Russia, high-level violence between the power bases of very influential people has an undeniable potential to spill outward. And ostensibly, one-on-one blood feud becomes a gang war between Kadyrov supporters and the supporters of his rivals. The violent exchange sows fear among communities and gets others across the region to consider taking up arms for self-protection. The region's long-standing and violent Islamist elements start to get involved, and before long, the Caucasus region is in uproar. Such a development could even compromise Russia on the battlefield in Ukraine, where Chechen fighters play a prominent role. But many Russian army recruits are drawn from poorer regions of the country, like Dagestan and Ingushetia, in a difficult setting where flaring tempers could become a massive problem for Russia's war machine. Of course, there are myriad ways that such an escalation could be avoided. Kerimov and others could back down rather than oppose Kadyrov. They could offer some sort of proof that they didn't order an assassination, or they could plead for a direct intervention from Putin. But as of now, the dispute hasn't moved in any particular direction at all, and so long as Ramzan Kadyrov is left simmering, the situation is not ideal for anybody. Thanks for watching.